Welcome to Live.Work.Thrive. I'm Michaela Birmingham, Scary Mommy executive producer, and I will be the moderator for tonight's panel. Now, depending on where you live, many of us are starting to see the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. Cities are coming back to life, businesses are reopening, and many of us are hearing what the in-person work policies will be at our offices. We are getting back to normal. Great news, right? Well, not exactly. In tonight's episode, we will discuss how the pandemic has impacted our careers and family lives and how getting back to normal may not fix many of the systemic problems laid bare by the COVID crisis. Specifically, we will dive into what companies are doing to support women as businesses reopen in person, how to thrive at remote work, the pitfalls of the hybrid work model and how these may hurt working moms, and strategies for negotiating a work arrangement that works for you and your employer. Let's meet our panelists. Tonight, we have Sarah Grechko. She is Executive Vice President, Chief Learning and Insights Officer at Mastercard. Thank you for being here with us, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Sarah is responsible for shaping the company's culture, growth, and performance. She has worked with Fortune 500 companies to facilitate executive transition and has expertise in employee engagement, leadership, and rapidly changing environments. I feel like we are definitely in a rapidly changing environment, Sarah. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We also have Professor Sadal Neely, who is the Naylor Fitzhugh Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Thank you so much for being here, Sadal.
I'm so thrilled to be with you.
Sadal regularly advises top leaders who are embarking on virtual work and large-scale change that involves global expansion, digital transformation, and working toward a common vision. She's also an award-winning author, and her latest book, you are all going to want to pick this up. It was published this year, and how perfect. I mean, how could you have planned this any better? The book is called The Remote Work Revolution, Succeeding from Anywhere. And it provides remote workers and leaders with the best practices necessary to perform at the highest levels in their organizations. Sadal, was that book in the works before COVID?
Very much so. Very much so, but never in my wildest imagination would I have thought that the whole world, knowledge workers, would be migrating home. But the book I started 2-3 years ago because this is a topic I've been looking at for 20 years.
Wow. So it's like you and the people at Zoom are just like, ha, 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 my time has come. Finally, it's my day in the spotlight. I love it. Okay. So before we dive in further, I want to hear all of these remote work best practices. We are going to do a quick few reminders for the audience. So you can submit questions in the comments wherever you're watching, and we may feature your question later on in the show. So stay around and tune in. Also, join our mailing list. You don't want to miss any of our upcoming virtual events. We have lots going on. Visit scarymommy.com/live-work-thrive to sign up and stay in touch. So let's get into tonight's topic. I want to start us off by thinking about the problem and putting this into context a little bit. And to do that, I want to show us a quote from Vice President Kamala Harris. And she says, "In 1 year, the pandemic has put decades of the progress we have collectively made for women workers at risk." And I think that is a very jarring statement, but it's the truth. Sadal, can you put in context for us exactly what Vice President Harris is referring to here, and how has the pandemic impacted female workers so severely?
So the U.S. Labor of Statistics has reported that over 3 million women have left the workforce since the pandemic has started. And not only that, another survey has identified that 570,000 moms have left the workforce. And this is because women disproportionately take on caretaking roles, not only for children, but the elderly and others. Also, a lot of women's support apparatus disappeared with the pandemic. Childcare, babysitters, all the ways in which we make it, access to relatives, all of that was completely gone. And so in the absence of smart, intelligent, flexible job policies, they've been opting out. And it is alarming, and we need to reverse this course as fast as possible.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think we'll discuss remote work shortly, but we need to acknowledge here that obviously, as you mentioned, not every job can be done remotely. We saw the value of these essential workers that you mentioned, Sidal, at the height of this crisis. They were really the ones who got us through it, and faced massive burdens emotionally, physically, and economically. Sarah, do you think that women will begin to rethink professions that, come with these associated risks? I'm thinking of teachers, nurses, caregivers, food services. Is it kind of like, that was it? This pandemic just kind of was the last straw for me. I'm out going forward.
I mean, I think that is definitely a real risk. I have a story close to home where one of my children's the teacher they were supposed to have this year, had to take a leave of absence because they could not come. My kids were going back into school, into a setting. This teacher's children were not. They were going to be having hybrid or remote, and she couldn't support both. And so she had to take a leave of absence from the workforce. I hope she comes back because she's a fantastic teacher. But I do think that's a real risk. The one, I guess, glimmer of hope I have is I do think from a lot of the conversations I've had with those essential workers, teachers and doctors and nurses, is they were also very drawn by the fact that they were so essential to keeping people sane, healthy, the focus on well-being. And I think that calling to the vocation is still very strong, despite how hard this past year has been.
Yeah, no, for sure. My mother was a nurse for probably 30 years. And, that was on non-pandemic times, luckily, but, it's hard work. You're on your feet all day. I remember my mother would work 12-hour shifts, sometimes the night shift, and she'd be exhausted. I mean, and that's just when you're not dealing with a major crisis. So I'm hoping that this is going to start this conversation that's long overdue about pay and paying these essential workers what they are really deserving of.
And childcare, I think, Sidal, you brought that up. That's a huge, I know for me personally, if I did not have childcare, I would have been one of those people that would have had to figure out something else and potentially opt out. And I think that's something that from a policy perspective, we've talked about it for a long time, and we're not making progress there. People are struggling. And this pandemic was a great example of how many women, one little thing happens, right, to throw things off, and it throws everything into chaos. And unfortunately, it means that I think some of these statistics that were shared with the amount of women that have had to leave the workforce, not want to, but had to.
Yes, certainly. And so, Sidal, given the amount of women who have left the workforce, in your opinion, what is the biggest obstacle to getting these women back to work? I've heard statistics that are saying that it will take us like 20 years or something to recover from this departure, because we've, it took us a long time to get to that level of workforce participation by women in the first place. And now we've erased that essentially.
I'm a bit more optimistic than that, only because we're actually about to enter a period in our history where the war for talent is going to heat up in ways that we've never, ever seen. In fact, there was just a Wall Street Journal, CNBC, all of these reports around 4 million workers. We're not talking women included, who have quit their jobs as the labor market is beginning to look different. And people are saying, I want more flexibility in my work. I will not tolerate inadequate jobs. I will not tolerate inadequate or incompetent bosses. And they're saying that my whole life is become different now. The work balance aspiration that most of us could never, ever achieve has now been transformed into this idea of work-life flexibility. So the way we address this is we become courageous and find ways to accommodate schedules, flex time, is one of the things that remote or virtual work affords us, meaning we segment the day in a way that can work for us and not the 9 to 5 that we've all been living prior to this. Although I don't know about you, I've never worked 9 to 5. But that's a whole other show, I think. And there's also the question of literally flexible schedules, 3 days on, 2 days off, just thinking about time and space in intelligent and modern ways. This is what this pandemic has taught us, that we don't need to be attached to a building and to a certain time frame for people to be incredibly effective. And we need to lean into that. And companies are going to be forced to evolve. There's no choice. There's no choice. The world has changed and they have to follow.
I think that's true. I think we're kind of at the cusp of this great reset, right? We have an opportunity here to reset all of these ways of thinking. Sarah, tell us a little bit about the Mastercard experience when, things did start to shut down. How did Mastercard help employees transition to remote work? I'm assuming much of your work did happen remotely. And how did that actually go? Was there, things that you point to as successes and things that maybe you could have done better?
Yeah. So we were one of those companies that I think it seemed in March of 2020, seemingly overnight, we went from 97% of our people coming into an office every day to 97% of our people not doing that.
Wow.
And I will say, there was kind of that everyone holding their breath the first week, like, is everything going to fall apart? Like, is work going to get done? Like, how is this actually going to work? It went surprisingly well. So I think we were we had already been on a journey of a digital transformation. Most of our, we have a largely knowledge and insight workforce. Many of our employees had laptops. So the transition for them, as long as they had the appropriate setup at home, right, access to Wi-Fi, they were able to actually pivot quite well. We do, though, I think sometimes, even in the United States, we take for granted some of the infrastructure that we had. We did struggle in a number of our countries, in Egypt, in some of our countries in Africa, where we have employees, where they actually they could not work from home. They could not connect. They did not have access to that technology that they needed to. And so we had to have some different tactics. So that was certainly one of the biggest challenges. But I think what we found, the bigger challenge, was not, can people, access the files, the servers, the information they need? Can they get on, Zoom and Teams and other types of virtual collaboration tools? It was that people started working 24/7. And they didn't have, the baked in commute time. That was kind of a break, that where they would leave the house or come back home. And so the burnout started early. And people just saying, not only am I having to figure out how to now work from home when I never did that before, we had some people who did, but for the most part, people were used to coming in somewhere. And I might be homeschooling children because they're not allowed to be back in school, or I might be caring for a relative that can't get the support that they were typically getting because of the pandemic. And so I think the big thing that surfaced for us was this focus on well-being, and organizational and individual resilience, and how important that was. And so we have now, throughout 2020 and now into 2021, are making significant investments to overall well-being and also to this notion of resilience. Great example, what's happening right now where India is in this pandemic. We have a large proportion of our workforce there. And all of a sudden, when those individuals need to be taking the time that they need to take to care for themselves and their family, what happens to the work, right? Where does the work shift? And I think a lot of organizations in the past had focused on efficiency, and that was really the goal. And now we're much, efficiency, we don't even really talk about. It's a lot about resilience, both at that organizational level, but also for our individual employees as well.
Those are such great learnings. I think, hearing this, I feel like there was a lot of misconception before COVID about, the day you say, oh, I'm working from home, on Friday because I have, the cable person is coming to do a hookup. And I could just see the bosses. Oh yeah, working from home, right? You're going away for the weekend, you're leaving early. No one's believing you for a second you're actually working. When in fact, it sounds like your research is showing a lot of people working more than they were before. Sadal, what are some of these other misconceptions and how does the data kind of align with these myths?
It's interesting because had people were looking at 30 years worth of research, they would have known that remote work increases productivity. Sarah, did productivity go up?
It did.
It did, right? And if you survey companies, you would find up to 70% would say productivity actually went up. But this hyper productivity, which is productivity gone wrong, where work and life would be blurring, is where people have gotten in trouble. And so you're not alone, Mastercard. This is something that's been happening all over the place because the boundaries between work and life was being completely blurred. Another misconception is that if you give people autonomy, if you give people flexibility, then they will go out of control. They will completely go out of control. This one leader said to me, what is going to happen once the pandemic is over and bars are open in the middle of the day? What's going to happen to our performance? It's like, first of all, I don't know why your people would be wanting bars, but that's a whole thing. But remote work is not new. When I talk to companies, I have to constantly remind them, by the way, hybrid is not new either, constantly remind them that we have so much history, so much evidence on how to do this well. So misconception is you give a little, people will just go out of control. Another misconception too is you can't develop personal connection, intimacy through digital tools, when in fact many say that video conferencing has been somewhat democratizing because everyone is cut down to a screen as opposed to when we have the physicality that we have in our in person only. So it has some democratizing elements. And the last thing I'll say here is Black women and Black professionals especially have reported that they've experienced the least amount of microaggressions in their professional lives now that they've gone remote. People confusing one person for another, calling someone a different name, the angry Black woman type of stereotypes that's imposed upon them, the code switching that they had to do in order to fit went away. So what this pandemic has unmasked, particularly for marginalized groups in companies, and this was true for others as well, but Black women particularly, Black women had to have this psychological commute they had to take in order to fit in, and they no longer had to do that. So it completely unmasked the ills of our cultures, of our corporate cultures, that is not friendly for diverse people. And that's another thing that we're learning.
That is such a positive change. That's refreshing to hear.
And I think the other thing on that, what it did was people in their home element, not only did it put us all on the same level playing field. And I have to tell you, I'm a very petite woman. I'm about 5 feet tall. And when I'm in a conference room, it's very easy to tell, right? Size, and you notice that stuff. When you're in a Zoom, you all kind of look the same size. And it is very empowering for people that may be in some of these more marginalized groups to be on that level playing field. I think we shouldn't underestimate that. For sure. One of the things, and I don't know, Sadal, if this came out in any of your research, but that we found through some of our internal research was that the ties between teams actually grew stronger. And part of that was, oh, my kid might run in, or you heard my dog barking, or I have to run for a second because someone's ringing the doorbell. And so those types of things made people very real and human, especially our leaders, who their teams may not have seen them in that way before because they always saw them at work. So I think that was a very bright spot. We did, though, notice that some of the ties between teams that are farther apart, more distributed, did grow weaker. Because they, your direct team you're working with every day. So you're probably on a number of Zoom calls. You're communicating with them quite frequently. But we had to be more deliberate with teams that didn't just have that opportunity to make sure that we were putting in place some things so that we could bring teams together that may not have that opportunity in a virtual world.
That's such a great point. I'm laughing because I have seen all of my colleagues on my team's husband shirtless walking behind their camera. Every single one of us has seen that for each other. And I won't lie, I have taken the laptop into the bathroom while I'm brushing my teeth and be like, I'm sorry, I just got to do it. And
Right.
nobody is even phased anymore at this
No,
point.
they're
It's
not.
like, we don't even have to address it. It's just like, fine, do your thing. I feel like we have 100% been, more tightly knit as a team for sure. So I think that is a great point to bring up when, they have these naysayers like, you got to come back to the office. So Mastercard, you had some initiatives in place pre-COVID that were there to support working families.
Yes.
Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about those and how you've enhanced that since the onset of the pandemic?
Absolutely. So again, I think we were lucky in a way that we already had some things in place. So we've had a flexibility policy in place for a number of years. And the policy is pretty broad. It basically says that any employee can request to work remotely, not in an office, up to 5 days a week, right? That's pretty much as flexible as you can get. Now, it's with manager approval. And one of the things we know from our own data is that typically more women were taking advantage of it than men. And that's where I think we need to watch out as we, Mastercard, like many companies, is moving towards more flexibility in the future. And I think we need to ensure that there is still equity across different groups as we go to these models. And one of the ways we're trying to do that as Mastercard is actually encourage everybody to take flexibility. So men and women. Our expectation is that everybody is balancing that because we think there is some work that is better done at home and depending on your job, right? That may be more days than less days. And some work where you're going to want to come in and be in person with your colleagues and feel that office vibe. And we're making a lot of investments in the office to be able to do that. But I think that flexibility piece and being true to that, and also making sure that it's being adopted across the board, not just from specific segments, is very important. The other program that we have that I'll just mention is what we call Relaunch Your Career. And again, this was in place before COVID hit. This is actually a way to get people who have been out of the workforce. It was initially targeted as women, but now we target any individual that may have had to take a leave of at least 2 years out of the workforce, an opportunity, an on-ramp back into an organization like Mastercard that in the past, typically, if you had that break on your resume, you might not get the second call back. And that has actually proven to be very, very beneficial, both for Mastercard, the caliber of talent that we're able to bring in, and also for these individuals, giving them, that opportunity to come into an actual program. So not only is it, giving them a job to start doing, but there's a whole program wrapped around it with mentoring and sponsorship and learning and development so that we really are putting a support structure in place to support those individuals.
That is great. Two things I want to say to Mastercard. One is you definitely were on the ball because my fraud protection has been top notch this whole pandemic. All right. I've been denied many times at Whole Foods. You're just being careful. I give you credit for that. Okay. So that's the first thing. And secondly, that program where you're not penalizing women for a gap, I think is so key. And I wish that more industries would look at that as, listen, my motto is you want something done fast and well, you hire a mom. Because a mom is
Agreed.
a multitasker. She knows a limited time and you got to focus and get the thing done. You hire a mom, tenfold the productivity of a non-mom. No offense if you're not a mom. But Sadal, I wanted to ask you about the logistics of the best practices here for identifying the needs of your employees, because of course, every organization is different. Not what works for Mastercard may not work for another company. But how does a company, go about identifying the employees' needs and balancing that with the business needs? Is there, something that you recommend? I mean, I'm hearing anecdotally, companies are surveying everyone and it's like 100% we want to keep working from home. And then every CEO has a heart attack, and then that's where we're at.
So you're right about everything that you just said, but let me just give it some color. So the surveying employees anonymously is very important, and underlining anonymous, because there's a lot of fears and perception that if I disclose my interest for virtuality or remote work, it's going to be seen as a sign of lower engagement, lower motivation. So anonymous gives you the truth. You'll really see where people are. And the numbers are staggering. They're not quite at 100%, but they're close. So the Gardner Group, 87% want some kind of flexibility in their work. Harvard Business School Online, 81% want some kind of flexibility in their work. JLL, commercial real estate folks, did a survey and found that 88% wanted flexibility in their work. So they're like, we need to innovate because real estate is going to be something, physical spaces that we need to address. And of those numbers, about 30% want full-time remote work. So those are the numbers, but we cannot forget the 15% or so who cannot wait to go back to the office. Millennials, younger people, those who are empty nesters, and folks in that age category want all the things that the office gives them. But the reality is offices have changed. Individuals have changed. The nature of work has changed. And this is the reality that we're finding. So the hybrid process has been underway for a number of companies already. And you have to have a centralized approach. I always put my hand over my head when I say this, a centralized approach where you set certain guidelines and policies. Sarah shared the most flexible one earlier. That's a policy. Twitter did the same thing at some point after the pandemic, 2 or 3 months after. But some are saying we want you in 1 day a week, twice a week, etc. You need some overall guidelines. And the reason for this is you don't want individual managers' biases and preferences to create inequities in your organization. For example, manager one is like, I love remote work. I love flexibility. Everybody do what you want. And manager B is like, no, I need structure. I need to see everyone. I need people in, and this is what I want. Next thing you know, you're creating tension and inequities and friction in the organization. Individual managers can negotiate with their team members, et cetera, but the policy has to come here. This is similar to diversity policies. You don't ask people embrace diversity, you set policies that they need to follow. Same thing completely. And then I want to say one more thing before I finish. There are people that we deem as on-site essential people. It could be IT folks who are tied to control rooms full of servers. It could be receptionists. It could be administrative staff that we rely on, particularly if we're customer-facing, client-facing environments. It's really important to create opportunities for those people for learning. So you give them 10 learning days and say you use this however you want. Otherwise, I think this is going to become a topic of inclusion that we're going to be worried about. The fact that certain people will feel like they don't have the luxury or privilege. You upskill people, you give them the days, and you include them in the hybridity that the entire organization is taking.
That is such a great point. We need to make sure that it's even across the board. And on that point, Sarah, I wonder if you could talk to us about, I know you mentioned Mastercard is rolling out this hybrid model in September, where you're going to be returning for 2 days a week, you said, right?
Yeah.
For 2 days a week.
And we've actually, it's in September for many of our offices, but we have some that are already in that model.
Already in
today.
that
So,
model now.
yeah. And actually, Sadal, I think you said it perfectly. You do need a framework that people can rally around. And so our framework is, again, always health and safety and security, number one. So looking at the local conditions, and obviously, as we mentioned, the US is in a much different position than some other countries, and even cities within the US, right, might be in different states. And so we look at that first. Once we feel comfortable that we can safely welcome people back, we're moving into this phase that you're talking about, which is we want people to start coming back 2 days a week, but we don't want them just to randomly choose, 2 days. So maybe I would come in Monday, Tuesday, and Zadal would come in Thursday, Friday, but we're on the same team. Well, we might as well just be working from home then, because we're not seeing each other anyway. So what we're asking is for our teams to get together and say, as a team, what does it make sense? When does it make sense for us to be in together? Obviously, knowing that we still need to be cognizant of different constraints that people have, right? Because we still have schools and childcare and even mass transit that aren't on normal, quote unquote, normal schedules that they have been. But what we've been doing is encouraging our teams and the leaders of those teams to have that conversation. And I think that's really important. I think having an open dialogue helps establish that trust. And we've been very open to say, we don't have this figured out. We're learning as we go. We're going to start here. We're going to learn from the sites that have opened and are going to this model, and we'll tweak as we go. And then what we believe is that different teams may decide differently. So there may be some teams that 2 days actually seems to work. There may be other teams that decide we want to be together 4 days. And we want to make that work. And it may be that 1 week it's one thing and the next week it's another. So it's not necessarily, we just have to decide and commit. So really a more of a test and learn approach and gathering that feedback, but really trying to instill the trust between the teams. The one, again, kind of a bright spot of the whole pandemic was all of a sudden, leaders weren't just able to look out and see their people and make sure they were working, right? We used to have something for people when they had to work from home, right? We'd be like, oh, are they just like Netflix and chill? And we joke about it now because what I think people realized was, oh, I don't have to see them to make sure that they're working. I can look at the output of what they're producing. And I think that is going to help create this sea change that I think is desperately needed and will help some of the more marginalized groups that we've had in the past.
So, Sadal, I would curious on what you think here. So I love this idea, Sarah. I love the 2 days a week. I think that the team's deciding, we're all going to agree, okay, Monday, Tuesday, we're all going to come in, whatever. What about the person who's like, I'm a millennial, I got no ties, I want happy hour and I want my salad for $15 at lunch and I'm coming in 5 days a week. Now, is this going to catapult these folks up the ladder faster than the people who are like still doing algebra for their children and taking care of grandma and doing a job and they just got a puppy and they have major regrets? Speaking from personal experience,
COVID puppy.
Don't do it. Anyone out there, just don't do it. How is this option, to come in more often going to play out in reality, Sadal? Because I think that's where we may get into this inclusion piece and it can get messy and create, some friction. What do you think?
So first of all, let me begin by saying that the research on whether remote workers versus the in-person people get held back in their careers is false. This is something that is very clear. You don't have to be in the office to get the development that you need. Individuals who are working remotely, who are not around, need to make sure they're proactively learning and developing and providing updates. You need to make sure that your presence is felt, even if you're not physically present. That's an important set of skills that people need to develop. But whether those who are in an office do better than those who are not is actually patently false. The data they don't support this. I will say, though, that the world has changed. These folks, hypothetically, that you describe, will go to the office and find no one there, which is what's happening. People are going back to offices and to environments that are very different than the ones they left. They themselves are very different. I can give you an example of one company in particular, a tech company, where they started to bring people back, starting from the 15% who were like, we are dying to come back, please. They said, okay, let's start this experiment. We'll start with you in 4 different locations. Day 1, they went back and they're like, oh yeah, okay, great. My $15 lunch, as you would say. Day 2, oh, this is, I forgot that I didn't like that commute. Day 3, actually, this doesn't feel right. Day 4, we changed our minds. Wow. So there is this culture shock, this repatriation of sorts that people are not expecting, that's going to hit people strong. And there are others you might have seen already. First day back, picture, click, excited, want to go back. But the euphoria of that kind of begins to decline as they look at the 2 hours a day commutes, as they look at the money that they're spending to be in the office, to park the car. People have cited $5,000 or more savings, which is a big deal for many families, right? By having this remote work. And going back to this notion of flexibility and the reduction of work-life friction are the things that people are saying, man, my values have changed. And also, I always have to remind folks that we are surviving on the way out, hopefully, of a global pandemic where so many people have died, been sick, and even have become disabled. People are very clear about their priorities, and the workplace is not a place you go to, it's the thing you do.
Yeah, and I think that values piece, actually, we were joking about COVID puppies, but a lot of our people are saying, I did get a dog or a pet, and now what do I do when I have to come back? And there is anxiety that people are having about what that looks like, because it was different than what they did before, the commute they had, what responsibilities they had. And I actually think this values piece, the thing that scares me, that I don't think we know yet, because I think we're just at the beginning of it, is for many women, especially women, knowledge workers, insight workers, who, especially if they're part of a dual income household, whose values have fundamentally changed during the pandemic and are opting out of the workforce, not to go somewhere else, just to stop, because they've decided that what they value is different now than what it was pre-COVID. And that's probably what concerns me the most, is the impacts that we're going to see there. That, again, I don't have any data, but my hypothesis is it will impact women more than men, furthering this tension that we already talked about with the amount of women that have already left the workforce.
The opting out of the workforce altogether. Well, my deepest hope is that, and I look to companies, and if you've seen me on LinkedIn or Twitter, I am like, everyone should be alarmed that I am literally screaming because with the absence of women in the workforce, I think we all are worse off. And we need to work hard to reverse these trends, which means make things attractive, like the relaunch program that you mentioned. I just want everyone to do that now, just to bring people back, because the diversity that many companies have fought so hard for on the gender end of things, they're going to lose if they don't do smart things. But I'll tell you this, there are companies that are working hard to retain their women. They're doing things like from 3 to 5, 2 to 5, setting up online virtual programs so that their kids are, kind of aftercare of sorts. Yeah. The companies themselves are creating those types of opportunities because they see people holistically, which is, I think, the era that we're in today. What employees are saying is, see me holistically, which is what people have done as they zoom into your bedrooms, or your living rooms. This is, I think, a new approach.
Yeah, and react to my needs, right? So last summer, especially in the United States, a lot of stuff was closed. So you couldn't send your child to a camp that you might have years before. One of the things that Mastercard did that I thought was really creative and was a huge success is we created virtual camp. So every day,
Yes.
children of different ages could sign up for different things, a cooking class, a coding class. And this was all paid for by Mastercard because we said, hey, our people are struggling as it is. Let's take some of a burden off of them, especially our working families, our working parents. And kids loved it. Like I was I was a little skeptical at first. I'm like, how's that going to work? Like, and they loved it. And it was helpful for the parent. It gave their child something to do. And our people were so appreciative that, again, we were creative in thinking about how can we meet them where they are today.
That is amazing. I love a cooking class for all ages. Fantastic. Scream that from the rooftops. I'm canceling my Amex. It's all going to be Mastercard.
Yeah.
So on that note, with summer approaching, and still, the camp situation varies drastically where you live. A lot of the kids are still unvaccinated if they're under 12. So parents are still nervous about all of the health and safety concerns. So, as we think about summer, I feel like another, issue that you have with the Zoom call is that what if I decide I'm going to go to California for a month with my family because we have more space there, or grandma lives there and she's got a pool and my kids are actually going to have some form of, fresh air. How do you navigate that as an employee? Because I'm thinking that, there is a bit of like, oh, well, yeah, you're on vacation. The minute you leave from your like dark, crowded, like corner bedroom setup, suddenly you're not working anymore. What do you think, Sadal, with the change of location? Can you really just do your job anywhere like the CEO of Twitter? Or like, is it a bad look to have a pool in the background of your Zoom?
100%. Listen, the people who have higher job satisfaction than remote workers are those who can work from anywhere. So hashtag WFH is less interesting to people, even though it's very interesting, than hashtag WFA, working from anywhere. And so historical arguments around we can't perform, we can't do well remotely, that we need to be attached to our physical locations are gone. So any arguments that bosses can make to say don't go to California it's just debunked. They would be exposing their lack of trust of others. They would also be exposing, in my mind, unless they read chapter 7 of my book, their lack of competence around leading a distributed group or distributed workforce, which I think is a required skill today. Leaders, managers need to augment their skills and figure out how to lead a group that's not there. So you may be thinking about California for a month, but the reality is the way the job market is heating up, the way that companies are interested in tapping a diverse pool of candidates, today they can look outside of their geographical core in order to get the best talent that they can find and say to them, you don't need to be extracted from your home and your community. We still want you. Join us as a remote person. They want to be able to say that. So I think these barriers are going to continuously shift and change and go down. And part of it is because the nature of work has changed. And the other thing I'll say on this is, Sarah, you mentioned digital transformation. I think if we get this hybrid workforce or workplace right, we are preparing for the digital revolution where we are going to not just be working with people. It's not just about collaborating with Sal and Sally. It's about collaborating with AI bot, right? Human to human, human to machine. This is right around the corner. This is right around the corner. So if we're not doing hybrid, if we're not moving towards a place where we're not attached to physical locations, how are we going to think about this artificial intelligence, machine learning revolution that's literally right around the corner?
Okay. And my prediction, many organizations have started doing this. I think a kind of table stakes benefit going forward for many organizations will be to give you 4 weeks work from anywhere. Doesn't matter. That's part of the expectation, because people are demanding it now. One of the things I've learned, because we're navigating this remote, people who have moved during the pandemic, and now it's like, okay, now what? They might have moved states, they might have moved countries. One of the challenges that organizations have to kind of put that lens on it is back to a policy perspective. There are tax implications, corporate tax implications, there's immigration implications. And those are some of the things that, typically policy lags some of these other changes. And that's what I think we really need to be partnering with governments on, is how do we help level the playing field in general from some of those things, so it's not disadvantage for an organization to be able to embrace these different types of models. Because I know we have examples where we're very willing, a leader is very willing, the organization is very willing to have somebody work somewhere else, but because of the tax liabilities, again, immigration implications, we're not able to support certain circumstances.
Yeah, from a domestic standpoint, companies like HubSpot are doing things like you can work from anywhere in the cities that we operate in.
Exactly.
So if you love where you are,
great way to start.
You see what I mean? It's a great way to start. It's a great way to start. That's exactly what I said to them, in that we're in Chicago, go to Chicago if you want. Right. We're in California, go to California. We're in North Carolina, go there, because we have the infrastructure in place. You can just plug and play. And that's how they're starting their work from anywhere.
I think that's brilliant. And I think that's great on the journey.
Yeah.
And so what would you say to someone out there who's watching, who's maybe in a situation where their leadership is not on these emerging trends? I love everything that you're saying, Sadal, but I feel like you are so far ahead of a lot of CEOs and managers out there who are like, why do I see palm trees in your backyard? What is going on here? Right? So how does an employee, either communicate that or, tell us, maybe Sarah, kind of what the law is, is there a number of days that triggers this tax implication if someone decides they need to relocate for whatever reason? How does someone navigate that? What's allowed and what's a kind of best practice on the side of the employee for navigating those changes?
Yeah, well, you know how the law is. I think in some ways it depends on a lot of factors. I will say what we've seen during COVID is there have been some relaxation of some of those rules. And so typically people are being allowed kind of a temporary relocation up to 6 months. And that is not triggering some of those penalties that you may have for something that is longer term. For those individuals, though, to answer your question, right now, employees are in the driver's seat. So I would say if you're in that situation, number one, I would hope you can have the conversation. I know some people may not feel comfortable, they may not trust. If not, I think what we're seeing in the labor market right now is unprecedented.
Yes.
And all the way up and down, different types of jobs that, not just people that might come and work at Mastercard, but different industries, different levels, different types of work. I think what we're seeing right now is a historic shift in really who has the power, and it's shifting from the employer to the employee. And what I believe will happen is organizations can come out and, we have these CEOs, as you mentioned, that are saying, you got to get back in here like now. So we have some of those. We obviously have some others as well. People are going to start talking with their feet. And what I would expect is, as this starts playing out, that some of those organizations that were on the end of the spectrum that was get back now, we need everybody back, are going to change their tune, because otherwise they're not going to be around to tell the tale. And I actually think that, in a year from now, I think we should all get back together and look at where we are and the companies that have thrived. And I believe the companies that will thrive are those that are embracing some of these things that we're talking about.
That's a deal. We have a date next year coming back.
I just could not agree more. I just could not agree more. That the power is in employees' hands, and the reality is employers have to earn their best people every single day. And what happens if you lose your best people? Because they have options. If you're good, you have options, and your best people leave, who are you left with? Those who are not necessarily the best and the brightest and the high potentials in your firm. And you will be hiring those who are willing, not the best people in the world for you. So they'll have a choice to make. And I think I've talked to many of those leaders, Sarah, who have said, we have no choice but to consider this. I hate it, hate it, hate it, but we have no choice but to consider this. The other thing that I'm seeing in many companies is there's a war inside the executive room where a percentage say, let's flex, let's be flexible, let's lean into this, and others say, no way. And the war is fierce. And I hope that flexibility and reality wins. But that's happening in a lot of companies.
This is spicy. I cannot wait to come back and see what goes on, because it's just so fascinating. I love this kind of shift to a whole new way of thinking. And on that note, we have a ton of questions coming in from our audience. So I want to hit you with a couple of those before we wrap up. So Sarah, I'll start with you. Here's one from the audience. I feel like my bosses think we're all working less, but we're all working more. Do I need to convince them of that? What do you think?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a big believer in a couple things. One is certainly letting your work speak for itself. So to be very focused on doing good work. And I think sometimes when we get caught up in the, do they think I'm working? Do they think I'm not working? You know, if they can IM me or not, does that matter? I do think your work should stand for itself. So always be focused on doing great work. But I also believe that you're your best advocate. And so if somebody is feeling that there might be a perception out there, I think they should advocate for themselves. I think they should have a conversation. And it may not be a conversation that says, do you really think I'm not working? But even a conversation around, hey, could use some coaching, trying to manage my workload, trying to understand priorities. Here's what I have. And really generate a conversation. I can tell you, bosses love when you come to them and say, I need some coaching. And you may not actually need the coaching, by the way. You may just want to kind of plug some feedback for them. But it's a beautiful way to disarm them and allow them to be part of the solution.
I like that. So the lingo here, I like it. Okay, so Sidal, here's one for you. Do you think remote working hurts women more than men? Meaning, do we look bad if we stay home more because of childcare issues when the men have the freedom to go back in?
It's interesting because I think what can happen is that if we don't feel present, even though we're not present, through how we do our work, our communication, asynchronously, synchronously, the products that we put forth, that's when it becomes a problem. I'll tell you a study that was done several years ago that made my head explode, is that in one particular company, men and women were working the exact same hours, but the women felt that they needed to take part-time status because they couldn't provide, in their own perception, the amount of effort, visible effort to the company. So they cut down their hours, but the men were working the exact amount of hours of the women, but they kept their full-time status.
Girl, that sounds all too familiar. Don't even get me started.
Hello. So women have to really be thoughtful, and they need mentors and coaches outside of their own organization, not to undermine all the possibilities for them, and also how they develop networks and other things, even though they're not physically there. There are methods to this, but they have to learn them.
That's a great point. Okay, so Sarah, here back to you. Although I prefer working from home because of family obligations, I do feel like a full day on Zoom can be more draining. What about Zoom burnout?
Yes, it's a real thing. And it's, fascinating to me that, 15 months ago, I don't even think that was like a phrase, Zoom burnout. People didn't even know what Zoom was.
I could not get that thing to turn on for
Right.
like an entire 2-year period. I was just like, Zoom, no, I don't want to do that. It's too hard.
Yeah. It is a very real thing. And actually, there is already some emerging research that shows exactly what that question posed, which is being on video does have different effects than being together in person having conversations. Some of it is the fact that, I'm like, Zoom, take my video away. I don't want to look at myself when I'm talking all the time. And just that strain of like really trying to read facial cues that is harder to do in a virtual world. One of the things that we're trying to do, and again, right, we're all learning here as we go, is to really be thoughtful about, does that meeting have to be on video? In fact, does it have to be me sitting in a chair at my home office in front of my computer? Can I go take a walk if we're just having a conversation, which we know is better for my well-being? We know being able to be outside in the sunlight, again, much better for our productivity, our creativity, and our overall health and well-being. And so what we've started encouraging our leaders to do is say, tell people when, either video optional, or even better to say is not video optional, but audio preferred. So put the preference in there, especially if you're a leader, that can be
required.
Exactly. Exactly. I do think, though, going forward, as more research comes out, and I hope there is more research because I think there's a lot that we can do in this space. We do need to create new norms around these virtual types of meetings, because you're right, people are very burnt out. Number one, they're working more hours. We already talked about that when they're working from home, and being on these tools and having to be on video all day is exhausting.
Can I just say though, Sarah, I need to send you a copy of my book. So you have to give me your address. Chapter 4 is all about this. Zoom fatigue, tech exhaustion should not exist. There's literally 50 years worth of research on what to use for what objective and how to think about digital tools, not just Zoom, but email, Slack, everything that's in our lives. This is probably what we know the most about, in fact. So I'll send you this thing so that you just, no more Zoom fatigue at Mastercard.
That's actually, I actually saw like a great quote that reminds me of that, which was, it's ridiculous spending your time trying to shorten something like a meeting that shouldn't even be happening in the first place.
Yes.
And I think you're exactly right, that we have to actually completely rethink, like, does that have to be a meeting at all?
Send me an email. Yeah.
Yeah. So now I feel like, that Slack, like little clickety click that alerts you. I hear that sound and I get like anxious.
Like nervous.
Like I'll be like trying to wash a dish at like 8 o'clock and all of a sudden I click, click. I'm like, oh no, what now? And it's like that they need to have options for that sound alert. Like, can it be like more calming, or can I change it up? It's triggering now, that beep. That's a index for your book.
Yeah.
Okay. So last question here. Sidal, going to work was my social interaction. Mentally, is it good to always work from home, or is it too isolating?
I think you have to recreate the level of social interaction that you need for yourself wherever you are. And so it may come from your community, your households, professionally even. You have to recreate what you need. Not everyone needs the same thing. Introverts, extroverts, these things differ, but working from home without creating the connection with others is a problem. And the other thing that we find is that you don't need to be hanging out with your own team in order to experience the connection. You can hang out with any team at your company or any individual, and you still get the nourishment that you need from a social standpoint.
That is such a great point. I feel like we could keep talking for another hour, but we were almost out of time. So I just want to let everyone know that our next live event will be on June 22nd. And the topic is Buy Less, Live Longer, How to Reduce Waste and Toxins in Your Home and Make Room for Your New Remote Workspace, because Sidal says this is the future. So start
your COVID puppy.
And your COVID puppy.
And your COVID puppy.
That too. Register now at scarymommy.com/live-work-thrive. So thank you so much to both of you. I think this panel has been so insightful and also inspiring. I think, there's some real innovation happening here, and it's been a pleasure to learn from both of your expertise. Professor Sidal Neely, she is from the Harvard Business School. She's the Naylor Fitzhugh Professor of Business Administration, and Sarah Grechko, Chief Learning and Skills Officer at Mastercard. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So have a great night, Scary Mommies. Our economy will not recover without the full participation of women. Let's have the courage to support each other in reimagining work in a way that we can all live, work, and thrive. Good night.